The Prime Minister announces Britain is moving to the next stage in the worst public health crisis for a generation.
So often, the currents of this torrid year have flowed most choppily through schools. Tasked more than any other public service with trying to be normal when things are anything but. Into this chronology of woe has come a late effort to arrange mass testing in schools by the start of January. News which drops into heads' inboxes on the last day of term. Many heads are incredulous.
We have to get parental consent if young people are going to have the testing. So that's a logistical nightmare already. If you look at school sites, they're massive. Because of the zoning and the bubbles, we've actually moved to 3 entrances. So we're thinking, well, where will that testing station go? Does it go with the Year 12 entrance or with the Year 7 entrance? Should it go in our amazing sports hall? That actually takes away teaching space. So that's another challenge. So the logistics of trying to piece together where everything is going to go is mind-blowing.
I spoke to the Department for Education today, who said that teachers won't have to actually be responsible for conducting the tests themselves.
Right.
But then they're saying that an army of volunteers will be able to do it and support staff. How credible do you think that is?
I'm going to say I think it's nonsense.
This disdain goes much wider than this corner of North London. Somehow, this announcement managed to do what almost never happens. It brought all the teachers' unions and educational employers' organisations together, issuing a joint statement condemning the government's plans as unworkable and chaotic. Further anger came today when Newsnight revealed that the Department for Education was offering £1,000 for civil servants to work over the Christmas period to help set the system up, with no equivalent for heads or teachers. But the backdrop and genesis of all this is as follows. Secondary school students have the highest infection rate of any age group. Ministers want this testing in place to bring that down and keep schools open. Others are now beginning to think that that might not be possible.
It's clear that secondary schools now are places where COVID is caught and spread. And we know that secondary pupils can transmit the virus very effectively into their families and into the community. So if the government doesn't get a grip, and if we don't start reducing COVID levels amongst this age group, yes, I think there's every possibility that we'll be in another lockdown and schools will be in that too.
But government says that's precisely why they want to bring in testing, I would imagine.
Well, then we agree that the government should bring in testing, absolutely, but not like this.
One thing's for sure, relations between school staff and the Department for Education, never warm, are now somewhere near subarctic.
DfE sources say that they're cognizant of what a huge problem staff absence has been, what a huge problem pupil absence has been. They're cognizant of the fact that there could be a spike in the early part of January, and they have this new testing capacity, so why not use it to ameliorate those problems? And that is all laudable. The problem is that it comes at the end of a year where the goodwill that would be required from within the teaching profession to get all of this new system up and running by the start of January has, after this year, all but evaporated.
For so many of us, it's been a year to forget, but we know in our bones we won't. Not least because we know its spirit endures that January bodes ill. If it's government's hope that mass school testing might make the coldest month more bearable, might avert lockdown, might keep the school lights on, they may need to think again.
Lewis Goodall there. So what should we be anticipating in schools and elsewhere in January? I'm joined by Baroness Louise Casey, former government advisor on social welfare, and Sir Mark Walport, the former chief scientific advisor to the government, who sits on stage. Sir Mark, let's start with you. Tonight, as we go on air, there are reports that this mutant strain of COVID-19 that has been spreading in the southeast, that it's sufficiently strong that the government may be thinking about bringing forward restrictions rather more quickly. What do you know about this strain? What's so powerful about it? Is it so widespread that it might change the policy?
Well, I mean, what we know is that there are 2 factors that determine the transmission of this disease. One of these is the properties of the virus, and the other is the way people behave and how they socially distance. And so what happens with viruses is that they do naturally mutate all the time, and the ones that are likely to do well are the ones that increase transmission. And so we know that this is a new variant. It has been seen in other countries, but it seems to be quite widespread, which suggests that it has got a transmission advantage. And scientists are working extremely hard to work out what's going on. And basically, there are three possibilities. The first is that it does transmit more easily. The second, that it might give a different pattern of infection. And the third, that it might become resistant to a vaccine. Now, the latter two seem rather unlikely at the moment, but it does definitely seem possible that this transmits more easily. And of course, it will make the social distancing even more critical.
And so how will it change January, what we face in January, if this is the case?
Well, the bottom line is that the situation is serious at the moment. It's obvious that the infection numbers are very high indeed at the moment. It's rising quite rapidly in London, in the southeast, in the east of England. And unfortunately, even in the parts of the country where the infection is coming under control, the cases remain stubbornly high. And so the NHS is under great pressure. Admissions are high, and sadly, admissions inevitably, in a proportion of cases, turn into deaths. So we're going into January in quite a serious situation where we do need quite strong measures to socially distance. And if the virus is changing, then that makes it even more imperative.
And before we bring Louise Casey, on this issue of schools testing, how realistic is that as a strategy that's going to work?
Well, I mean, firstly, it's an enormous logistic challenge. And if you like, one of the really serious capacity issues is staff in the NHS and teachers in schools. And we know that they're under immense pressure. The second thing about the testing is that it's not a complete magic bullet. So the sensitivity of the lateral flow tests that are being used means that they only pick up somewhere between maybe 50% and maybe 65% of the people that are most infectious. So it will miss cases. But on the other hand, it will discover cases that haven't been found by other means. But it's not the complete answer.
OK, Louise Casey. So, I mean, if testing has its challenges, is the answer to delay the return to school even further?
Well, I'm not an educational specialist, but just listening to that, the bottom line is that we have to keep the schools open as best we can, that we know that the impact on particularly kids from disadvantaged backgrounds is really, really profound. So, I'm up for testing, and I'm up for testing from day one. What I'm not up for is how late in the day this decision was made. As just been said, what Mark has just said, the huge logistical implications for schools, not helped tonight by the Department of Education offering £1,000 bonus to civil servants that are prepared to work on the project over Christmas, but that same offer not being made to colleagues who are in the teaching profession. So I think the government just wobbles all the time around making strategic decisions and seeing them through.
Gavin Williamson wants to bring in the army, centralise the issue, get it sorted.
Yes. Well, I think somebody today said that it often feels a bit more like Dad's army than it does about the army, and I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, OK, let's talk in your specialist area, the social consequences of a possible third lockdown. I mean, it's been terrible obviously for incomes, for poverty. What would the consequences of a third lockdown be? Well,
I mean, the starting point here is this, that pre the pandemic, we had high numbers of people in poverty, very high numbers of people now homeless, and people living in temporary accommodation, families essentially locked up in single rooms with all of their family, and if they're lucky, a microwave. It wasn't great before the pandemic. What the pandemic has done, and particularly lockdown, is it's just pushed what we already knew was a problem into a really, really difficult and horrific place. So we've got something like almost 400,000 additional redundancies between March and October. We've almost doubled the number of people on universal credit. The stretch between the haves and the have-not is now way too stretched. And so when you go into the new year, I think what the government needs to think about is how do we get a reset, particularly for families that are struggling. And they're vast numbers now. It's like these are ordinary people that are affected.
You're working on the ground in trying to feed people, essentially.
Well, yeah. Who thought that I would be, having had a long career in public service, I'm now working in food banks and helping people who are queuing for food in the United Kingdom. It's like one of the legacies from this pandemic cannot be that we quadruple the number of soup kitchens and food banks. That would be a disgrace. And I think what I'm trying to get across here is I met a woman who was coming out of a food bank. I helped carry her shopping to her friend's car. Clearly, she can't afford to get to and from the food bank. her and her partner had both been furloughed. They couldn't afford that 20% drop. Now she is on universal credit. She waited 2.5 months for that universal credit to come through. I can't tell you how awful her life was, and she literally has been surviving simply on that food bank. I saw another woman walk in and was so hungry, and she was a very thin woman, and she stuffed a cake directly into her mouth because she was that hungry.
The government would argue that they've extended the furlough scheme at 80% through till the end of April. Now it's more than a year of those subsidies.
Good. They should. But
extended other support packages for commercial firms.
So the issue here is that in the preceding decade to this pandemic, the amount of cuts, austerity brought to public services and to individual incomes of people on welfare support literally have. We're all in this storm, right, called this pandemic. Some of us are in yachts, and some of us on rafts that are literally sinking. We knew before the pandemic that if you live in a deprived area and you're a woman, you have 8 less years of your life than a woman who lives in a non-deprived area. Same statistics. What the pandemic has done is pulled that even further and further apart.
Let me just bring in Sir Mark. So, I mean, obviously very costly in terms of the social infrastructure, the idea of an extra lockdown. I mean, but, you know, Neil Ferguson, your colleague, or former colleague on stage, says that we have to be even tougher now than we were in November. Do you agree with that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, the point is that I agree with everything Louise said, but of course the other issue is that it's those socially deprived and disadvantaged people who are the most severely hit by coronavirus as well. And so if you want to see an illustration of the social determinants of disease, coronavirus is it. And so it is a terrible situation, but Louise's point is absolutely correct. And of course, the people that find it hardest under many circumstances to do the social distancing are the people who are socially deprived because of the nature of the work they do and the conditions in which they live.